Maybe you should avoid those woods. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I have a review for you. This is a review of Tales Accursed, a Folk Horror Anthology. This comes out the 3rd of October, and I received a review copy in exchange for an honest review. And as it sounds like on the cover, this is a collection of folk horror stories. And what you should know going into this collection is it's primarily classical folk horror. So the earliest story in this collection is from 1870, and the most contemporary is written by Shirley Jackson. It was published after her death, but she died in the 1960s. So I don't know exactly when it was published, but it can't be later than that. And of the 16 stories in this collection, the vast majority of them, I'd say 12 or 13, are all published before 1930. I can appreciate if you are curating a collection to have more than half of your stories in the public domain, probably makes it a little easier to get your project off the ground. This is the editor's, Richard Wells is the editor. It is his second collection of folk horror stories. The first one was called Damnable Tales, and I haven't read that, so I don't know how the two collections compare. I actually really appreciated this collection. Again, you have to know that it's going to be classical folk horror coming in, and that I would have actually loved to have a few more contemporary stories, and I'll get to why in a moment. But what he did is he curated it in such a way that he presents them chronologically. And, often when I read a collection of short stories, the way they choose to be presented, that curation is important. And chronologically almost seems a little lazy sometimes. It seems just like the easy solution. Yet here, I thought it was really a smart move because it shows the development and progress of folk horror as a genre or as a storytelling modality. I am not going to kind of review any of the individual stories because I don't think that's very useful. But what I will say, and what was interesting to me reading this story, is you see the preoccupations of folk horror and how they develop. And that was what was exciting to me. First off, from narrative structure, the overwhelming majority of these stories are told as if they were a story being told, right? So the character we meet in the first pages says, let me tell you the story about, old Tom Jones. So it is never this happened to me. It is let me tell you something that I know about that happened to someone I know. Or it's a story they've collected from, journal entries or things like this. If you think about folk horror and stories that are told around campfires and contemporary urban legends, which come directly from folk tales and folk horror, it makes sense that this is the narrative structure, because you may not have had this thing happen to you, but you definitely know someone it happened to. Oh, that was my cousin or my cousin's friend. Like that kind of feeling. You get that feeling in a lot of these narrations. And that I think is an interesting thing to note that the narrative style is very similar. That's not the case for all of them. Some are told from the point of view of like a close third person narration. Some are told from the point of view of first person narration. But overall, you have the sense of a story being told. You aren't brought into a life lived. You know this is a story. And because of that, it's a warning, right? Which is an interesting part of folk horror in general, is that they're warnings. They're morality tales in many ways. Because at the heart of almost all folk horror is this tension. It's a tension between the urban and the cosmopolitan and the modern versus the forest and the woods, the bucolic, the rural, the ancient, right? That tension is at the heart of almost all these stories. And it's almost always a person from the modern world going back to the rural environment for rest and relaxation. And they're told, oh, don't go to that hill. That hill is the weird hill. Stay away from there. Don't go in that forest. Or don't go investigate that circle of stones. We just leave that alone. And of course, the modern person isn't content to follow local superstition. They believe that they have moved beyond the chaos of the past, and that hubris leads them to do the thing they're told not to do, and as a result, they have consequences. So this tension between the old and the new, between the forest and the city, between the old ways and the new ways, that is at the heart of so many of these stories. And you see it change, though. Even though you have that tension, it changes. In the early stories that are presented here, the representations of the forest are forest creatures like fae folk, fairies, goblins, other fantastical creatures that live in these ancient places, the pre-human almost. But then slowly, as the stories develop. Instead of just being fantastical creatures, you see that what is set against modernity are the old gods. And it's old gods and old traditions that are facing off against the colonizing force of Christian views and modern religions, and showing that you see in more than one story, they come in, all these new priests don't know the old ways. And if you really want to be protected, you have to go to one of the old priests who may give you some sort of Christian talisman, but they'll carve ancient runes on it because they know sometimes in order to subdue the old gods, you need to adopt the old ways. So there's this tension. So it's no longer just fantastical creatures, but it is these like malevolent powers or these old, very earthly, godly powers that predate civilization. And then as you move forward, then you start getting into ideas of the occult and of witchcraft. And so it's no longer just the forest. It's no longer just pre-civilization, but it's modern people who are actively adopting the old ways, right? Who are finding power in the old ways. So the encroachment of the past into the present is even stronger in more contemporary stories. And you get a few stories like that in this collection, but they're ones that are closer to the end, closer to modernity, which is why I would have liked to see some late 20th century and early 21st century folk horror included, because, that the sense of modern man trying to rein in the past, not just subdue it, but use it for their own benefit and to use it to empower them to move forward, I think is the interesting progression of folk horror, and we lose that a little bit in this collection since it stops in the mid 20th century. But with that said, I had a really great time with this collection. I had a really great time tracking how folk horror develops and how the heart of it is still the same in contemporary horror that I know and love, with these tales that are 150 years old. You see a definite progression. And part of what I love about folk horror is this tension, right? We believe we have put the past behind us. We believe that we have conquered something, that we have taken the chaos and created structure, created order. And these stories remind us that just because we've moved away from something, it doesn't mean we've conquered it. And it's always waiting at our heels to remind us that it's there. So the stories remind us not just on the very gross level to, be afraid of what's dark in the woods, and to be afraid of traditions that are other than your own, that maybe predate your own, but it causes you to look in yourself for that tension. And it says, what do you think you've conquered? What of your internal chaos do you think you have moved beyond, that you've created structure or order from? And have you really created that order? Or is that chaos just bubbling under the surface, waiting to remind you in your moment of hubris that all you've done is look away? So for that reason, I think folk horror is really exciting to me, really fun to read. I think this collection is a strong collection. Again, it's a classical collection. So there is a great diversity in the stories, the 16 stories here. But if you were to compare these 16 to a collection of all contemporary folk horror, you'd find probably greater diversity in that collection of contemporary folk horror. Just in terms of pacing, in terms of structure, in terms of definitely character representation. So there is a little bit of sameness in these stories insofar as the vast majority of them are written between 1870 and 1930. And as a result of that, they have a mode of writing and narration and a series of preoccupations and tension that feel very similar to one another, even though they deal with different locations, different countries, different types of supernatural forces. They have a sense of familiarity among them. So you should know that going into it. I should also say, as part of this collection, the editor is also a graphic artist, and for every one of the stories, he created a lino cut print, which are wonderful. They're really, really beautiful. And, lino cut prints are very similar to woodblock printing, and they definitely encompass the theme or the feeling and the atmosphere of folk horror. So I thought it was a really wonderful addition to the collection to have these art prints for every story. Whether you're reading it even just digitally or you have a physical copy, I think the art definitely complements the story in a wonderful way. So that was a smart decision on the part of the curator/artist. One thing I will end on is that if you're interested in folk horror, there is a lovely documentary that came out, I think in 2020, maybe 2021, called Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. And this is focused on folk horror in cinema And it starts with 1970s cinema. And there is a trio of films that were released in Britain in the 1970s, which is where the term folk horror was really coined in its modern usage. You see examples of it, I think, as early in the mid 1800s, but the contemporary use and idea of folk horror as a storytelling device was really coined in reference to these films that came out of England in the early 70s. And this documentary traces folk horror in cinema, starting there in England and then eventually going to look at folk horror in cultures all around the world, and how the tension between the past and the present is at the constant heart of folk horror. And it's interesting, at least one of the interviews talk about how folk horror shouldn't really be thought of as a genre as much as it should be thought of as a collection of moods or a collection of themes and ideas and a storytelling modality that is encompassing a certain type of internal tension, which is an interesting way to think about it, because I'm used to thinking of it as a genre. How do you limit your imagination and your understanding of something when you define it as a genre, as opposed to a collection of ideas, a collection of preoccupations? And because definitely you can see within the quote unquote folk horror genre, both literary and in film, there are some that are more on the realm of fantasy, some that are more in horror. There was a big movement to have these sci-fi folk horror stories told, at least in film. And so it's an interesting exploration. The documentary is streaming. Depending on where you live, it might be streaming on a different service. I believe it was originally produced for Shudder. I think is also streaming on Amazon Prime and on Apple TV. So depending on where you live, you might have access to it in a different way. It is long. It's a little over 3 hours, which is long, but it is broken up into 6 chapters. So you don't have to take it all at once. And I think it's a really wonderful complement to this collection. So just to end, I think this collection is really strong. I think if you're interested in classical folk horror, you can't get much better from this. I didn't know most of the authors going into it. There were some names like M.J. James and Algernon Blackwood, and of course, Shirley Jackson. Other than that, most of the authors were new to me. So depending on your relationship and history in the folk horror space, they may or may not be new to you. I think it does a great job of illuminating the inherent tension that is a preoccupation of folk horror and that tension that exists within all of us. So I do definitely recommend this collection. I had a lot of fun with it. As long as you approach this collection knowing that the most recent story in this collection was written sometime before the 1960s and that the majority of them are written before 1930, then you're in the right mindset for it. I think that is the one limiting factor of this collection. I had a great time with it though, so I hope you do too. What do you think about folk horror? Have you conquered the chaos that is your past, or is it just waiting to catch up with you? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you for spending time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourself, take care of each other, and go slowly.